Our next session and the last one is one that I am really excited about, and I'm especially pleased that our panelists have agreed to let us make this one public and on the record because it's such an important discussion. For our last shout out, we'd like to give a call out the WITA team who have been so integral to making this event possible, starting with Maya Ghazi, WITA's program manager, Rafael Augusto Centino, the WITA Academy Fellow, and our WITA interns, Jackson House from St. Louis University, Lily Johns from James Madison University, Antonio Mejia Hernandez at Syracuse University, and Andrew Choi at the University of California, San Diego. Thank you very much for your help with everything we did for this seminar. Maya, Rafael, Jackson, Lily, Antonio, and Andrew, and of course my colleague, Diego Añez, the Executive Director of the WITA Academy. Thank you all for all your help. Now we'd like to welcome onto the screen our final panel to talk about U.S. trade, U.S. bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral initiatives, bilateral and unilateral initiatives. Marjorie Chorlins, Senior Vice President for Europe at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Eric Farnsworth, the head of the Washington office of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society. Wendy Cutler, Vice President Managing Director at the Asia Society Policy Institute and a former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Liser, the President and CEO of the Corporate Council of Africa. And our moderator, our good friend Penny Naas, the lead for GMF at the German Marshall Fund for Allied Competitiveness. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ken. And wow, for all of you that have made it this far, congratulations. We're the last panel, so hopefully you've absorbed everything from the past few days, and we're going to have the opportunity to wrap this up for you with insights from a fantastic panel. So I think in part what we want to do with this session is really to help all of you learn about some of the unique U.S. trade policy events that are going on in regions around the world, with the exception of USMCA, our last panel, and then to tease out some of the overall trade policy trends, building on the different things that you all have been learning about the last few days. So I'm going to start with posing a question for each panelist to answer. I'm going to go to Wendy Cutler first, so I'm giving her a heads up. Wendy, it feels odd that you're not in the moderator chair and I am for a WITA event. So, but I'm going to ask each of you to start by identifying what are the goals of U.S. trade policy and economic engagement in your regions, and how are the actions that they take, particularly on trade, reflective and implement those goals successfully or not? And I'll let you comment on that as well. So with that, Wendy, I'm going to start with you.
Well, thanks, Penny. And it's a great honor to be with a lot of my friends on this panel. And I think we all have a commitment to make it as interesting as possible for the viewers, particularly those who have survived the boot camp that Ken has put them through. So just a few words about Asia. First, I would say that we need to keep in mind how important the Asian region is to trade. It's the fastest growing region in the world. It's the home of a lot of innovation, both on green technologies, on advanced and emerging technologies, on cars, and whatever, just you name it, it's happening in Asia. And there's also kind of a growing middle class. So for a lot of our companies, when they look around the world and they're looking to sell their stuff, Asia seems to be an important destination. As a result, our trade relations with Asia, really up into the Trump administration, were all about market opening. Clearly, we were trying to open those markets, but we were prepared to further open up our market in return. This changed with the Trump years and has continued to be different in the Biden years. And frankly, I think we're on a different trend line now, and I hope we can discuss more about where we are going. In terms of our trade policy in the region, given that we're not offering market access, which continues to be of primary interest to countries in the region, frankly, our leverage and our ability to be solid and forward-leaning trading partners is not as great as it used to be. We clearly are looking to work with our partners to establish an affirmative agenda in the region, but one that goes beyond trade. And here the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the major Asian initiative, Asia-Pacific initiative by the Biden administration, was really, I think, a step forward in trying to define our international economic agenda more broadly than just trade. And ironically, all the other parts except trade in IPEF have now been concluded, have been ratified, and are being worked on, with the trade pillar kind of sitting in limbo right now. I'd like to just say the IPEF is all about an affirmative agenda. The word China does not appear in the agreement, but clearly for the United States, when we think of Asia, China is in the back of our minds. But I'd like to just emphasize for our listeners that this isn't all about countering China. Our trade agenda in Asia is not all about countering China. It's about putting forward our values, our interest, and kind of, the direction we'd like to see the region go into in this area. That said, and maybe I'll just conclude here, China is kind of the elephant in the room when we talk about trade with Asia. China is pursuing a very robust trade and investment agenda in the region. Whether being a partner in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it has applied for membership to the CPTPP. It is making some really innovative upgrades to its FTA with ASEAN, among other initiatives. And so I think we need to look at all of this and figure out what this means for our interests in the region. So let me stop there, Penny.
Super. Thanks, Wendy. And I think I'm going to go next to Eric, because I think there's some really interesting intersections on trade policy between the United States, Asia, and Latin America, particularly through the APEC concept work, but also through some of these pathfinder agreements that we're seeing New Zealand, Costa Rica, Iceland, Switzerland move forward on trade and climate. And so, Eric, let me turn to you to get your take on what are our goals in Latin and South America, and how is trade policy helping us achieve those goals?
Well, thanks, Penny. It's really good to join you and everybody who's online with us. Although I have to make a complaint that I really hate following Wendy Cutler, because it's virtually impossible to do that successfully anyway. So thank you for nothing. But no, I do appreciate the opportunity, and Ken, of course, the invitation, and WITA, you always do a great job. I think it's a really important question. Let me take a step back and frame it just a little bit. Trade policy has been the lead initiative for the United States in the Western Hemisphere going back to the Summit of the Americas in 1994, with some variation, but to the point where this has been the way. Wendy alluded to the leverage that the United States had with market access. This has been the way to help try to incentivize countries to take steps on things unrelated to trade, like democracy and the environment and labor rights and such. And they were willing to do that, or at least give lip service to that, because they were able to gain market access to the United States. Once that agenda began to soften, let's say, the incentive to take steps to strengthen democracy and other actions that we find convenient really has been reduced, to the point where we saw the last Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles in 2022 had virtually no trade agenda whatsoever. And I think this is a really important framing of where we are with the Western Hemisphere, because at the time when the rest of the region was looking for increased economic and trade activities with the United States, in part to help them out of a very difficult COVID scenario and sluggish growth that has bedeviled the region for a long time, and frankly, to compete effectively with China, the United States was not able to offer the type of market access agreements that we might have in the past. Now, some say that that's because we already have trade agreements with much of the region, and that's true. You've certainly covered USMCA. Prior to that, there was NAFTA, of course. We have agreements with Central America. We have bilaterals with Panama, Colombia, Chile, Peru, etc. And so, you can go down the line, but those agreements were from 20, 25 years ago. And, think about the world today versus 25 years ago. There's no digital, chapters in the Central America agreement. Some of the things that we take for granted now in terms of the course of business aren't covered at all in terms of the agreement. So yes, there is coverage, but they need to be updated in a very significant way. So the administration, realizing that there was a need for this, and looking to put something on the table anyway. Wendy referenced the IPEF. We have the APEP in the Western Hemisphere, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. That's a mouthful, but that doesn't include trade, right? So the APEP is really an agreement that asks countries to take on greater obligations, but there aren't a lot of benefits. And that's something that I think has been a active discussion among leaders in the region. Who are looking to have a greater sense of why they should be doing some of these things. Having said that, it does provide a framework. It does provide a basis for conversation. It does provide an active, conversation around things like chips, computer chips, and supply chains, and things that are very important to the hemispheric conversation. There is one other point I want to raise, at least initially, and that is that one of the things that we have learned through 30 years now of engagement on trade in the Western Hemisphere, and I'm starting this with Mexico and Canada and the NAFTA, is that trade really has to have some flexibility. We have to start building flexibility into our agreements. And I think specifically about some of the dramatic changes that have been happening in Latin America over that course of time. Look, you have countries like Nicaragua that have gone from, imperfect democracies to flat out police state dictatorships. Countries that, have free trade agreements with the United States. There is no chance that Nicaragua would have an agreement with the United States at this point, or would have the ability to enter into one. And yet we have a free trade agreement with Nicaragua that puts Nicaragua on trade terms in a better position than some of our regional allies around the hemisphere. It makes absolutely no sense. They should not have a trade agreement with the United States. And I think, you see some of the changes that are going on right now in Colombia. You see today the inauguration in Mexico of the new president. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have trade. That's not the point at all. The point that I'm making is these are going to impact, and they are already impacting the conversations about the trade dialogue with those particular countries, particularly as we look forward to the discussion, let's put it that way, of the USMCA in 2026. So the politics of the region are becoming quite interesting as well. We can talk about some of that, or some of the individual initiatives, CPTPP or APEC, or some of those initiatives as well. There's a lot going on. It's an interesting time, an interesting place.
Thanks, Eric. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about flexibility, because I also think something else that's a buzzword right now, kind of in the trade space, is also about speed. And we haven't exactly been speedy with regards to how we've negotiated certain agreements. I'm going to turn next to Flory, because Flory actually has, I think, a couple of big things going on in her region. And then we'll have Marjorie kind of take it home on the opening questions. But Flory, let me turn it to you with regards to, what has been our policy with regards to Africa, and kind of where do things stand at the moment?
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you to WITA, and wonderful to be on this panel with friends and so many who've been a part of the trade family for a long time. So with Africa, the trajectory on trade with Africa really started from the transition from focusing on development assistance with them many years ago, and establishing the African Growth and Opportunity Act back in 2000, and ensuring that it would be more of a foundation for promoting trade with the African countries, providing them with a competitive edge in the U.S. market, building on GSP and allowing them to send additional products to the US market duty-free under AGOA. And, you know, there are lots of debates about has it been successful or not. But I think that, you know, the way that I measure it is that though the amounts, the volumes and the value may be small from our perspective, when we look at Africa, you know, when you had 23 out of 35 countries that are eligible for AGOA in 2023 that exported more than $1 million in products to us under AGOA. And, you know, $1 million may, you know, on our end is really nothing. But when you go to those factories, you see those women, you see the youth that are in those factories who are a part of those value chains and shipping products to us from footwear to apparel, you know, value-added agricultural products. It has been a success. Could it do more? Absolutely. The one thing I didn't hear my colleagues mention, trade capacity building and technical assistance for the Africans have been critical. If they don't have that, frankly, you know, they're not going to be able to take advantage of the opportunity there. So, you know, AGOA will be expiring, unless it's renewed, it will be expiring September 30th next year, 2025. There are many of us who are urging Congress as well as the administration to work with Congress to get it extended ASAP. We were trying to get it extended last year and for as long as possible. And that extension of AGOA, I'm assuming it is going to happen, hopefully soon. That extension of AGOA comes at an important time because the Africans themselves have launched the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. And what that does is create a huge a free trade area and market. It reduces the barriers not only to intra-African trade, but it makes the Africans more competitive for those who are trying to have regional trade and investment policies, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, but also continental policies, and where you can invest in one country and be able to access all the other countries and to pull in what is needed in key value chains. It also comes at an important time post-COVID when the Africans are looked at as providing some diversity in supply chains. And there is a shift that's happening. It's small, but a shift that's happening from reliance on certain products coming from China and shifting that production and manufacturing to Africa, where they have now put in a more enabling environment. I think other areas of trade with Africa, also building on that, during the Trump years, they launched a U.S.-Kenya free trade agreement negotiations. There's only one country on the continent that has an FTA, and that's Morocco. And so we at Corporate Council on Africa and many of the private sector are very strong supporters of looking at going beyond AGOA. Now, under the Biden administration, they did not continue that FTA. However, they have put in place and are negotiating a U.S.-Kenya Strategic Trade and Investment Partnership, a STIP. And the STIP, frankly, has like all the chapters that are usually in FTAs, but there's no market access. We've been told that there's no market access now in this phase, but there could be market access that happens later. During the recent historic state visit of President Ruto of Kenya to the U.S., it was the first since like 2008 when Ghana's president came. They raised this. It was discussed with President Biden that they want an FTA. They want to go to that next phase. They want to complete the STIP by this December. So I understand there was recently USTR led by Connie Hamilton and the interagency had another round of talks. And so they're looking to try to really finalize the STIP, but there is also interest from the Kenyan side for an FTA. And frankly, there are other African countries that are raising their hands and saying, we'd like an FTA also. Mauritius is one, Rwanda is one. Rwanda was the last bilateral investment treaty that we signed with an African country. And that was in 2008. And so, you know, frankly, we do have bits with some of the Africans, but they're very old. As I said, the latest one is with Rwanda from 2008. So that, you know, that kind of tells you something. I think the last couple things I'd mention is that in that area of collaboration between the US and the Africans to increase trade and investment, because it was aid, then trade, and now it's really investment is the focus. You have Prosper Africa, you have support for investments and exports from the US of equipment, et cetera, from Exim Bank. You have DFC that's financing in various, excuse me, projects on the continent. And you have a focus on infrastructure and developing infrastructure there. Excuse me, the private sector is really looking at Africa anew. They'll be providing a large portion of the world's labor force. They've now got this AFCFTA, which is one of the largest free trade areas in the world. And they're looking to grow their businesses by investing in the continent in various key sectors, including green, green energy, solar, wind, et cetera. And the USG is actually supporting that. We had a signing on a solar project, $900 million at CCA's US Africa Business Summit in May in Dallas. So there are things that are happening on the continent in terms of trade, not as much as frankly old, trade hands like myself would like to see, but it's a start. And, with the support of the US government, with enabling environment policies and, regulations that need to be put in place on the part of the Africans, we push them to do that. That is how we can really advance the US-Africa trade, investment, and business relationship.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Flori. Thanks for that. Overview. I think it's really important to understand. In particular, I think the trade relationship with Africa has been evolving the most in the last few years, from development to trade to investment. I also think, in going to some of the points that Eric and Wendy were making, there's some really innovative new trade agreements out there, and we'll dip into that next, when U.S. trade policy is also being maybe innovative, but in a different direction. So, and I wonder how our partners perceive all of these different innovations and which ones they may prefer. With that, Marjorie, I'm going to turn to you to bring it home with regards to the U.S.-Europe relationship.
Penny, thanks very much. And thanks to Ken and the team at WITA for including me in today's session. I'll try to be brief, since we are the panel standing between you and whatever it is you want to do for the rest of the day. Look, when you think about what's innovative in trade nowadays, I think all of the three regions you've just heard about are much more exciting and much more active in a way than what's happening in the relationship between US and Europe. Nonetheless, it is an important relationship. In fact, the US and Europe are each other's single largest commercial partner. That's both in terms of trade and investment. We enjoy an $8.7 trillion relationship, which accounts for at least 16 million jobs directly on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, when I talk about Europe, that's Europe writ large, right? So that includes all of the member states of the European Union, the UK, Turkey, and the members of the EFTA, so Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and very importantly, Liechtenstein. But I'm going to focus my attention right now on the relationship between the US and EU in particular. When it comes to the relationship specifically with the EU, again, a huge relationship, heavily based on substantial investments each in the other economy. We are each other's largest foreign investors and account for roughly 60% of each other's FDI. In terms of trade, we're talking about a $1.2 trillion relationship, which averages out to about $3.5 billion of trade a day. So the relationship is really substantial. It happens that even as we are each other's seemingly strongest partners, we are like one big family where, in addition to loving each other, we also like to hate on each other. So the US and Europe have had over the years countless trade disputes. I think at one point there were as many as 50 trade disputes pending before the WTO that involved the US and EU. So it is a fraught relationship, to say the least. Now, there are a couple of major disputes that I will touch on in just a minute. But let me talk specifically about whether, the state of the sort of free trade agreement type negotiations between the US and EU. Practically speaking, unlike in these other regions, there is no US-EU FTA. The EU has 40 plus trade agreements with 70 plus countries. I think everybody knows that the US has 14 agreements with 20 countries, and we do not have that relationship each with the other. This is not for lack of trying. There have, over the last 20 or so years, been multiple attempts at promoting trade dialogue, starting with the Transatlantic Business Dialogue in 1995, the Transatlantic Economic Partnership in 1998, the Transatlantic Economic Council in 2007, and then, of course, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, that began in 2013, but ended in late 2016 and was formally whistled to a close, I think, in 2017. 15 rounds of negotiations there, meant to be a pretty comprehensive agreement, but the negotiations foundered on some not surprising issues around things like agriculture, differences on sanitary and phytosanitary standards and geographical indications, differences on regulatory regimes in several sectors, differences on things like procurement and investment dispute resolution. So didn't get anywhere on TTIP despite 15 rounds. More recently, the US and EU launched the US-EU Trade and Technology Council in 2021. There have been 6 rounds of negotiations six principals meetings, I should say. They're not actually formal negotiations. Really meant to focus on coordination in terms of emerging technologies and making progress on things like working together on AI, working together on developing tools that we can use in coordination with respect to the anti-competitive practices of non-market economies and so on. There is a second T in TTC, and that's for trade. And practically speaking, that part of the agenda has really been non-existent. So we've seen a fair amount of work among 10 working groups with varying degrees of activity and varying degrees of transparency. So suffice it to say that this has been a dialogue that has generated some interesting results, but without really demonstrating substantial improvement. Let me turn back very quickly. In between TTIP and TTC, of course, we had the Trump administration. And I think everybody knows that the former president's views with respect to Europe were not charitable. He has traditionally viewed Europe as not an effective partner for the United States, whether on trade or on security. That it's a very unfair relationship. And so he moved forward on a couple of key disputes, one related to subsidies provided to large civil aircraft manufacturers. This is dubbed the Boeing Airbus dispute. It's a dispute that literally stretches back decades. Formal WTO cases were filed in 2004. And over the years, we got to a point where under the Trump administration, the U.S. had the authority pursuant to a WTO ruling to impose tariffs on imports of EU goods, which they did. And of course, the EU followed suit with countermeasures. In addition to the Airbus-Boeing dispute, the Trump administration decided to impose tariffs on imports of EU goods following a Section 232 determination with respect to imports of steel and aluminum. This is the so-called national security exception. Here again, the administration, the former administration, imposed significant tariffs on Europe. Europe responded in kind, and we sort of limped along during the last administration as far as any sort of real progress in the trade relationship. Enter the Biden administration, 2021, we saw two important developments. First, the suspension of tariffs related to the Boeing Airbus dispute. The tariffs on both sides were suspended pending final negotiation, if you will, around a mutually acceptable solution with respect to aircraft subsidies. And also with respect to the steel and aluminum tariffs, the administration decided to pause its tariffs on Europe, and Europe did the same, in anticipation of negotiating a global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum. Progress on both of those issues has been scant, to say the least. So where we find ourselves with this administration is, I should also say, the Europeans looked at this current administration and thought it would be a welcome change from the last administration in terms of the aggressive stance on trade. In fact, the Biden administration has retained tariffs in both, the tariffs have remained, although they have been suspended, as I said. But there hasn't been a lot of progress on either steel agreement or on final resolution of the subsidies dispute. Likewise, idea of negotiating sort of a critical minerals agreement to allow Europe to take advantage of certain provisions related to the import of EVs into the U.S. pursuant to the Inflation Reduction Act. That hasn't gone anywhere. So in terms of broad U.S.-EU trade relations, I would say it's been a rocky road up to this point, not surprising. There's a lot that we are doing together in a variety of fora. But in terms of the bilateral relationship, it's been terrific on one level, given the size and the scope, but it has also been fraught.
Thank you, Marjorie. You know, I think having listened to all of you, one thing that I'm reminded of is that trade isn't always driven by trade policy. A lot of the trade that we see around the world is driven by transportation availability, tax policies, availability of talent, and a lot of other factors. And so I think it's really interesting to hear some of this and kind of why we would offer market access trade agreements and what are some of the other goals we're trying to achieve with our trade agreements in that way. I'd love to come back to you all, maybe in a couple of lightning rounds. I'd also encourage the audience to use the Q&A function and send in any questions you might have after hearing from our panel so far. And if there's anything specific you want to quiz them on. I'm curious from each of you, and I'll kind of have two questions, first, and then we can maybe come back for the second. But first is, what are some of the innovations in trade policy that are going on in your region that may not include the US, but are things that are perceived as being more impactful or interesting for some of our partners in our region? And then I'm going to come back to you with a question about how do our partners perceive the US trade policy right now, and where do they think that things are headed in their world? Wendy, I'm going to come back to you to start. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, pick one kind of innovative thing going on in your region that is maybe important for our audience to know.
Yeah, so while Asia is still pursuing comprehensive trade agreements through the implementation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and through the CPTPP, we're also seeing the emergence of what I would call kind of like one issue, or sectoral agreements, kind of bites of an FTA. And why is that happening? I think in some ways it can be easier to achieve agreements on one issue or one sector versus, the 30 chapters of an FTA. And Penny, you mentioned the issue of speed. I think that's incredibly important too. I mean, some of these agreements, by the time you start them to the time that they actually, kick in on implementation, we're talking 5-10 years, and the world is changing very quickly. And so maybe I'll just mention, I'm going to break your rule and just mention a few of these kind of agreements that are going on, mainly led by Asian countries, but also including countries from Europe and countries from the other side of the Pacific. And here I would point to the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. I think digital is probably one of the earlier issues that was kind of broken off, where you've seen these sectoral agreements. DEPA has a number of partners, Korea the latest to join, but a number of other partners have raised their hands and are negotiating accession to DEPA, including China. But we've also seen agreements on indigenous folks. We've seen agreements on gender and women. And most recently, and I think, Penny, you alluded to this in your opening remarks, a very innovative agreement on the environment and climate led by New Zealand, but also including a number of other countries as well. And, when I look to the future of trade, I think this is where we're headed, because again, I think these comprehensive free trade agreements are becoming just very difficult to negotiate. I mean, Marjorie mentioned how we tried with Europe, and frankly, I can't tell you how many different USTRs I worked for during the years. They kept saying, let's do an FTA with the EU because this will be easy. It's not easy. They're not easy. And frankly, sometimes they're even more difficult with countries that have sophisticated regulatory systems, because they don't want to move and we don't want to move. And so again, I think the innovation is going to be finding areas of interest. And also from the US perspective, one area where we're really pressing for agreements in the supply chain world is on semiconductors and on critical minerals. So again, when I look to the future of trade, I think Asia's doing a lot of innovative stuff, including partners from around the world. And I would also say many of these initiatives really involve middle-sized countries taking the initiative, because the US, we're kind of stepping back from the leadership role, and other large countries haven't filled the void.
Thanks, Wendy. Eric, maybe, I'm sitting in Brussels today, and there's quite a bit of talk going on about EU-Mercosur still.
Why?
Okay, well, maybe that's because it's slightly happier than talking about CBAM and deforestation and a few other topics that are going on here.
We've been talking about Mercosur EU for 25 years, and we're not closer today than we were.
Keep talking about it. Keep talking about it.
Keep talking.
So I guess I would love any insights from Latin America, South America, from your perspective.
Yeah, and thanks very much. And one of the things you said in your earlier comments is that trade isn't just driven by trade, right? I mean, it's driven by so many other things. I would add a healthy component of politics. Clearly in the United States, of course, where things are heading, and we've had many discussions already over the last few days about that. But that's very important within Latin America. Intra-regional politics is sometimes overwhelming. And when it comes to Mercosur, you now have 3 countries that see the world quite differently from the 4th country. It happens to be the 4th country is the largest, Brazil, right? So you have Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, who fundamentally, or their governments anyway, see the world in a different way than Brazil's government. That's going to make a conclusion of this agreement, to say nothing of the French agriculture sector, particularly complicated. But let me also put that in a different perspective. You asked for sort of innovative things going on in the region. One of the most innovative in Latin America began in the 2012-2013 timeframe. That was the Pacific Alliance, and it was with Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia, a very exciting, comprehensive economic agreement, not just trade, which was frankly not just exciting, but world-class in what they were trying to do, putting together their stock markets, putting together their labor markets, bringing together their trade agreements in a way that was mutually beneficial. And then you had the election in Mexico of Andres Manuel López Obrador, who saw the world differently and didn't want to participate in the same way. And then you had the scenario in Peru and the non-recognition of Mexico. And so there are two parties to the agreement. Now they don't even talk to each other, right? So you have countries in the region that, you know, they may be partners in a formal sense, but they're not working together. They're not expanding where they could be going together. And that's real and it's problematic. And so what was a very promising and exciting initiative has really run aground, and it shouldn't, but that's what we have. So then you have other countries that are looking to break away from that straitjacket and say, well, wait a minute, we don't have to be bound by the politics of somebody else. And so you have countries like Uruguay, speaking of Mercosur, that is applied for and is looking to join CPTPP. A really interesting initiative. Costa Rica is doing the same thing. Small countries, relatively unthreatening to anybody. And you know, Costa Rica is a member of the OECD. Why shouldn't they have access to CPTPP? And so, you know, this is something, frankly, that the United States, even if we aren't willing to have a broad trade initiative or agenda with the Western Hemisphere, we can be supportive of our allies in their trade ambitions. And I would like to see a lot more of that, right? So that the United States should be calling up Tokyo 5 times a day and saying, why isn't Costa Rica in the CPTPP yet? Or the same thing with Uruguay or what have you. The third thing I would say in terms of innovation, and we're not quite there yet, but Wendy alluded to it, and I think she's absolutely right, and that is the idea of the environmental side of things. And look, you can't talk about global climate change and environmental issues without Brazil. You can't. It doesn't make any sense. Or the whole Amazon basin, which is, you know, I just got back from Brazil last week, reminded again of the absolute immensity of the place. I mean, it is, if you haven't been there, it's just extraordinarily large as the continental United States. And the point is that the environmental issues globally have to be, you know, considered within the Latin America context as well, or more accurately, Latin America has to be part of the solution. To my way of thinking, this should give a great opportunity, particularly for the United States and Brazil, the two largest economies in the hemisphere, to put aside the challenges that we've faced over the years for whatever reasons we could go into, but that would take a whole nother seminar, and find a way forward on the environmental side and begin to talk in a comprehensive way about free trade in environmental goods and services. I mean, we talk about, you know, politics drives trade. Well, there's one thing that, you know, Washington, you can get an agreement on, and that's China. And the other is, you know, we need to do something on the environment. Those issues come together in an agreement on those issues with South America, particularly with Brazil, which also has its own strategic ambitions. So, I mean, if we think about these issues creatively and reorient how we address some of them, I think we can at least have a fresh start. I don't know that we can get to an ultimate conclusion, but at least we can get a fresh start. So some of those issues that you and Wendy and others have raised, I think, are just absolutely right, and, you know, put that into the conversation.
Thanks for that. I'm actually going to, Marjorie and Flori, I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that have come in. I'm going to ask you if you can address them. So Marjorie, in particular, just given your experience, I wanted to ask you, Casey has sent in a question asking about, in the last few administrations, we've seen this pullback from traditional FTAs. And in particular, we've seen the support for trade weakening. Mm-hmm. And Casey's asking, and I think you've touched on this in the US-EU context and the absolute complexity of trying to move things forward there. But, you know, given your experience, what could be done to kind of reinvigorate the trade agenda? And, you know, is it right to go back to a traditional FTA, or are some of these new, more innovative agreements the right way forward? I'd love your take, Marjorie, and then Flori, I've got an Africa-specific question for you after that.
Penny, thanks for the question. I'm not sure I'm best positioned to answer it, given that we have former USTR negotiators on the panel as well. But look, from my perspective, at least as it relates to Europe, trade, it's interesting, when you poll people in the United States about how they feel about trade, broadly speaking, perhaps surprisingly to some, there is a lot of public support for trade. When you talk about free trade agreements, in part because of the experience with NAFTA/USMCA, the public opinion about trade agreements is not a favorable one. In fact, it's pretty low on the list. So there is a bit of a duality that we have in the mindset of our policy officials when it comes to trade. And I think that especially with an current administration that is attempting to think about trade in a new way, an administration that views traditional trade negotiations as having been too focused on market opening measures, with what they perceive as less of a focus on things like worker rights and the environment and human rights and things like that. You've got a sort of natural shying away. I don't necessarily see us going back regardless of which administration comes in. There is, by the way, one notable exception, possibly two. One is with respect to the UK. There continues to be interest, surprisingly enough, in the possible negotiation of a US-UK FTA. Prospects of that happening anytime soon, I would say, are very, very low. But if there is a bright spot on the horizon, it's probably that. But I think it's important to recognize that it's not just the US who's moving away from the frame of the FTAs as their basic platform. We see this happening in Europe as well. There are some major trade agreements either on the table, ready to be adopted, or on the horizon, like Mercosur, like India, like improvements to the Mexico agreement. But what we see from an incoming commission is less emphasis on those market opening measures and more emphasis on, first off, on trade defense. So again, defending against those anti-competitive practices, and on finding ways to maintain relations while really being focused inward on Europe's lagging competitiveness. So I don't know if the days of traditional FTAs are gone in the United States, but it certainly seems like that is just not the way the current public discourse would seem to lead us.
Frankly, Marjorie, I think when I look at the Draghi report, which is a report on how to improve the competitiveness of Europe, one of the things that struck me about that is we almost, market access isn't what they need. What they need is access to the US innovation ecosystem,
yes,
and access to US technology, which is not something that you would normally negotiate as part of a free trade agreement. So I think there's some interesting part of the FTA is it still maybe works, Flory, in parts of Africa, but in some of the more developed countries, it's really, people want access to US technology in Silicon Valley and the ecosystem that we have, more than to have a tariff at 2% versus 5%.
Could I just jump in and say before Flory jumps in, simply to say that while the FTA construct is not alive and well, seemingly on life support, the US and Europe have been driving something called the Mineral Security Partnership, right? Which is an agreement initially between 15 countries. I think another 15 have just been added in, focused on trying to improve the supply chain for critical minerals in a way that isn't consistent with the traditional trade agreement. So it isn't that they're not trying to find ways to deal with some of these issues. And you're absolutely right. Europe is really busy right now, focused on its own competitiveness or lack thereof. But I do think there are some bright spots on the horizon. Maybe not for you.
Marjorie, I thought you answered that question great. So, Flory, we got a question in asking how we can help, not necessarily with AGOA, but how can we make sure that the Africa Free Trade Agreement is successfully implemented? And I think there's some really interesting and innovative things in that agreement as well, going back to the questions I was asking earlier, whether it be AI or gender or some other things, digital trade. Some really interesting stuff. Would love your take on that question.
Right. So to combine both the question on, innovative approaches as well as the one specifically on AFCFTA, got to give the Africans credit that in 4 years they were able to actually negotiate a digital trade protocol that does a lot of the things that our companies, would like folks to do, and the rest of the world hasn't been able to do that in terms of digital trade, e-commerce. And so you got, we think that's a good sign, and welcomed by, many of the U.S. companies who want to see, cross-border flows of data and so forth happen, more effectively on the continent. On AFCFTA, it may not mean as much as people, might claim it to mean, but there was an MOU that was signed between USTR and the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, the Secretary General, during the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in December 2022. And to me, what that signaled was a recognition by the USG and by trade folks that they need to look at the relationship, the economic relationship with Africa in a more continental fashion. So it talks about, collaboration and cooperation. And, it reminded me a little bit of the TIFAs that we used to have, the Trade Investment Framework Agreements. I think they still exist, but I don't think that they function well. There are about 12 of them with the Africans. And as far as I know, those haven't been functioning, but many still welcome that there was this MOU. On critical minerals, there was also a signing of an agreement between the U.S. and Zambia and the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, also again looking at ways to cooperate and collaborate in pulling the Africans in more to that value chain, where they are actually some of the largest suppliers of those key critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, etc., but they get very little of the value addition that they need. There's not as much investment in that. And so, we're looking at how can there be cooperation between the U.S., between international financial institutions, the World Bank, Afrexim Bank, the African Development Bank, and others, to incentivize investment into value addition of critical minerals in Africa. And there are also people talking about, some say it'll never happen, but people are talking about adding a provision to AGOA that would include the Africans for the purposes of the IRA, where they identify FTA partners who can then, benefit from the provisions of the IRA in that area, and get the supports there. They're talking about adding a provision in AGOA that would treat the Africans under AGOA in the same way that we would treat the FTA partners for the purposes of IRA. So that's sort of interesting and innovative.
And Flora, I'm just mindful of the time, and we've got one more question. So from the Africa Free Trade Agreement, you think that the more we can establish linkages between AGOA and the Africa Free Trade Agreement in maybe some critical areas, the more we can, that's one way we can try to help with the successful implementation of the Africa Free Trade Agreement.
Right. It's a win-win all the way around, because it supports intra-African trade and key value chains. It pulls the Africans into those value chains globally. It supports investment that's needed into the infrastructure. And we hear that during President Biden's, his sole trip to Africa during his administration will be to Angola in a couple weeks, and they'll be looking at the Libido corridor in terms of a regional approach to infrastructure that will indeed support trade within the region, but also across the continent and with the U.S. And I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you, Flori. Wendy, I'm going to come back to you because there's a question about how can given the solar tariffs and what's going on with clean tech in the US at the moment, how can the US look at expanding our market access and our company's market access to countries, particularly in Asia? And I'd just love if you could maybe give us your quick thoughts on that. And then I'm going to turn back to the panel for final thoughts quickly before we end this panel.
That's a difficult one to answer, in that China is investing more and more in particularly Southeast Asia, in not only with respect to solar, but in other green technologies. And maybe I can then maybe answer your last question too, because I think one of the key questions on the trade agenda going forward is going to be rules of origin, how to treat, products for the purposes of assigning tariffs and providing market access, et cetera. So to date, it's been based on the origin of the product, but I think we may be entering into a world where the nationality of the supplier is going to become more and more important, particularly as tensions between the US and China on the trade front escalate. But also just concerns about circumvention of companies moving around the world trying to escape regulations that apply to them when they stay at home. So with that, hopefully I've done a twofer and you can turn to the other folks.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks for your efficiency. Eric, what are your final thoughts?
Final thoughts are, we have to up our game dramatically in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is in play. China's all over that. Others are too. It's a natural market, natural partnership for the United States, but we can't take it for granted. And so we have to up our game. There is an exciting initiative in Congress right now called the Americas Act, which brings together a lot of these strands we've been talking about: access to countries in the Western Hemisphere to USMCA, dramatic redefinition of what the DFC should be doing in the region, all kinds of various things that don't have time to go into. But look, if we're going to actually compete, we got to compete. And we really haven't been in the last, any number of years. We've just been coasting. So this is a time to really figure it out. The emerging markets, broadly speaking, not just Latin America, are in play. And if we don't compete for them, we're going to lose out. So this is the time to really rethink that approach. And I think the Americas Act gives an opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Eric. Flori, final thoughts?
Just, I didn't mention it before. I think Wendy touched on it. The idea that the U.S. needs and wants to enhance its economic relationship with Africa because of China is really, that hasn't been the Biden message in particular, that there is an understanding that we have a strategic relationship with the countries in Africa, that there are economic and commercial opportunities for the U.S. and our businesses there. And I personally think that we're not in Africa to counter China. Hopefully there'll be some balancing there, but that we're there because it makes sense for the U.S. It makes sense for U.S. businesses who want to expand. And, if it happens to counter China there, that's fine. But that really shouldn't be the driving force for our trade relationship, our economic policy with Africa. So.
Thank you, Flori. Marjorie, final thoughts?
Yeah, very briefly. Look, I don't see a lot of forward movement when it comes to the US-EU trade relationship. Maybe the TTC continues under the next administration, maybe it doesn't. But I think the really important point is right now, Europe is very much focused inward. You mentioned the Draghi report on European competitiveness. There are low productivity, sky-high energy prices, an insufficient sort of ecosystem for innovation, and most of all, just a tsunami of overregulation coming out of Brussels that really has an impact on business. So for this incoming commission, we're going to see much more of an inward focus in terms of getting their own house in order. They do also say very clearly that Europe should not be forced to choose between the US on the one hand and China on the other. They don't want to be reliant on China for various goods. They don't want to necessarily be reliant on in the US when it comes to the security relationship. They want to build up their own security capacity more, obviously in concert with NATO. So I think what you will see going forward is ongoing conversation, trying to find ways to work with one another, trying to coordinate, for example, as they did on export controls and sanctions when Russia invaded Ukraine. But I just don't see a lot of what I would consider sort of traditional trade negotiations happening anytime soon.
Thank you, Marjorie. So I want to thank the WITA staff for a fantastic panel and for a fantastic conversation and for all you do to help educate people on what's going on in the trade world. I took away from this conversation that there's a lot of really interesting regional development going on, and that while China may be in the back of people's minds, what's in the front of people's minds is some of the other objectives that we want to achieve in each of these regions. I took away from this, there's a lot of stuff going on issue-specific topics. Critical minerals is a hot one in a lot of places. We didn't mention the WTO in a lot of this. So again, this was a regional conversation, but the fact that that doesn't factor in is kind of an interesting observation I would make. And that market access is something that powered past trade agreements, but we seem to be entering a new era where we need to think about what else besides market access. Ken, I turn it over to you. Thanks again to my panel. I appreciate all of you. And what a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Penny, Flory, Eric, Wendy, Marjorie. You are all friends. So it was a pleasure to see you together. I will say, Penny, we opened this morning with Angela Ellard talking about the WTO, and of course, WTO rules undergird all of our trade policy initiative, all of our trade policy around the world, and every other country's trade policy. So it's embedded, but wasn't a direct focus of this particular conversation. You guys really laid it out well. There's so much going on around the world, and the U.S. is observing a lot of those conversations, but isn't helping lead those these days. And the U.S. presence is missed. When I was in Geneva earlier, I guess it was last month at this point, that's one of the messages we heard. They were glad that the business community was there, but the U.S. was not driving a lot of these initiatives the way it used to, and that is missed. There's a lot of strategic, commercial, and economic reasons to trade more, especially with friends and allies, but also to raise living standards in the U.S. and around the world, and we're going to continue to drive that discussion here at WITA. So thank you very, very much. Really appreciate you. Thank you, everybody who was with us for these full 3 days. Thank you for those of us who just jumped in for this last session. Really appreciate everyone joining us for this. You're all, if you're attended this event, we hope to have you at our future events. We're going to be doing a lot more of them. Watch your calendars, watch your inboxes for announcements about upcoming events. Thank you very, very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.